some knowledge becomes dangerous not because it can harm, but because it inspires fear. In the antebellum South, control was maintained through silence, intimidation, and the deliberate suppression of understanding. A slave who could think, reason, and learn was far more threatening than one who merely labored. Physical strength could be broken with chains or whips, knowledge could not. It traveled quietly, whispered in the shadows after dark, taking root where no hand could destroy it. This is the story of a woman whose understanding of the natural world was so precise, so profound, that it unsettled those who claimed to own her. Her hands could heal with one plant, take a life with another depending on what she chose to gather from the forest. She never raised her voice. She never openly defied authority. Yet men of wealth and power locked their doors at night and tasted their meals with caution, fearful of the unseen force her knowledge represented. Her name was Annie Turner, and what she knew made her the most feared enslaved woman in Tallahassee County, Mississippi. Annie arrived at the Hartwell plantation in the spring of 1838. Though her past was a mystery, no one knew where she had come from, and no one bothered to ask. Thomas Hartwell, a prosperous cotton planter whose fortune had surged in the previous decade, purchased her at a slave auction in Natchez. The ledger from that day, still preserved in county records, lists her simply as Annie, female, about 16 years old, field hand, nothing more. No history, no origin, just a name, an age, and a price. There is no mention of her previous owner, no documentation of her place of birth, nothing to indicate that she was anything other than another nameless piece of property changing hands. But Annie was not like the other slaves who arrived at Hartwell Plantation that spring. Within her first week in the cotton fields, she demonstrated an unusual attentiveness to everything around her. While other workers focused solely on their tasks, Annie's eyes constantly moved, observing the plants growing at the edge of the fields, noting which birds visited which flowers, watching how the older slaves treated minor injuries and ailments. She collected seeds in her pockets. She touched leaves with careful fingers, sometimes bringing them to her nose to smell their essence. An elderly slave named Ruth, who had lived on the Hartwell plantation for nearly 40 years, noticed Annie's peculiar behavior first. Ruth had been the unofficial healer in the slave quarters for as long as anyone could remember, treating everything from fever to wounds with pices and teas made from plants she gathered in the surrounding woods. When a child named Samuel developed a persistent cough that summer, Ruth made her usual remedy, a tea brewed from wild cherry bark and honeysuckle. Annie watched Ruth prepare the medicine with an intensity that made the older woman uncomfortable. "You studying my methods, girl?" Ruth asked, not unkindly. "Just watching?" Annie replied softly. "That cherry bark you're using too much. It'll make him vomit before it helps the cough." Ruth's hand stopped moving. She stared at the young woman, with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "And how would you know such a thing?" "The bark has a poison in it," Annie explained, her voice calm and factual. "A small amount opens the lungs. Too much turns the stomach inside out. You need half what you're using, and you should add wound if you can find it. White flowers grows in the dry places near the barn." Ruth wanted to dismiss the girl's presumption, but something in Annie's tone gave her pause. There was no arrogance in her voice, no challenge. She spoke about plants the way others might speak about the weather, as simple observable facts. Against her better judgment, Ruth reduced the amount of cherry bark and sent Annie to find the wound. The tea worked. Samuel's cough eased within 2 days and disappeared entirely within a week. After that, Ruth began to teach Annie everything she knew, or rather, she tried to teach her. What Ruth discovered was that Annie didn't need teaching so much as she needed access. Once shown a plant, Annie seemed to understand it completely, what it could do, how much to use, which parts held the medicine, and which parts held danger. She learned the healing arts not like a student memorizing lessons, but like someone remembering something they had always known. By the fall of 1838, Annie had surpassed Ruth entirely. She treated a child's fever with willow bark tea. She stopped an infection in a field hand's cut finger, using a paste made from wild garlic and pine resin. When one of the house slaves suffered terrible stomach pains, Annie brewed a tea from wild ginger root and peppermint. That brought relief within an hour. The slaves in the quarters began coming to her instead of Ruth. Then they began coming to her for things Ruth had never been able to treat at all. Annie never refused anyone. She never asked for payment or favor. She simply listened to the symptoms, walked into the woods or along the creek, and returned with whatever was needed. But she did something else too. Something that no one noticed at first. She began keeping notes. Since slaves were forbidden from learning to read or write, Annie developed her own system, small marks carved into pieces of bark, patterns of pebbles arranged in hollow logs, notches cut into specific trees in specific sequences. To anyone else, these looked like random scratches and natural formations. To Annie, they were a vast library of information. She marked which plants grew where, when they flowered, how much rainfall they needed, what they could treat, and most importantly, what they could kill. Because Annie understood something fundamental that most healers never fully grasped: the difference between a medicine and a poison was usually nothing more than a matter of amount. Thomas Hartwell first became aware of Annie Turner's abilities in the winter of 1839, when his youngest daughter Caroline fell ill with scarlet fever. The family physician, Dr. Edmund Foster, had been treating the child for 3 days with the standard remedies, bloodletting and callum, but Caroline's condition only worsened. Her fever climbed higher each day, and the bright red rash spread across her chest and throat. Dr. Foster privately told Hartwell that he should prepare for the worst. It was Martha, one of the house slaves, who suggested an alternative. "Master Hartwell," she said, approaching him with obvious fear in her eyes, "there's a girl in the quarters, Annie. She got away with fevers that Dr. Foster don't have. She saved 3 children this winter already." When everyone thought they'd die, Hartwell's first instinct was to dismiss the suggestion. The idea that a slave girl barely out of childhood could succeed where a trained physician had failed seemed absurd. But he was desperate, and Caroline was his youngest, his favorite. He told Martha to bring Annie to the house. Annie arrived carrying a small cloth bundle. She was 20 years old by then, thin and unremarkable in appearance, with eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She stood in the doorway of Caroline's room, and Hartwell watched as she studied the sick child for a long moment without speaking. "The mercury medicine," Annie finally said, her voice quiet but certain. "It needs to stop." Dr. Foster, who had remained at the house, bristled at the contradiction. "That is callow, girl. It purges the sickness from the body." "It's poisoning her," Annie replied, still looking at Caroline. "The fever is from the scarlet fever, but the shaking and the darkness in her mouth, that's from the mercury. She's fighting 2 battles now instead of 1. The room fell silent. Hartwell looked at Dr. Foster, whose face had gone red with indignation, then back at Annie, who waited with perfect calm. "What would you do?" Hartwell asked. "Stop the mercury. Give her willow bark tea for the fever, cool compresses, with witch hazel water on her throat and chest where the rash is worst. Elderberry tea to help her fight the sickness itself. Keep her drinking as much as she can. The fever will break in 2 days if the mercury stops now." Dr. Foster protested vehemently, but Hartwell made his decision. He told the doctor to stop the callum treatments and instructed Annie to prepare her remedies. For the next 48 hours, Annie remained in the house, preparing teas and compresses, monitoring Caroline's breathing, adjusting her treatments based on subtle changes in the child's condition. On the morning of the 3rd day, Caroline's fever broke. By the 4th day, she was sitting up and asking for food. Within a week, she had recovered completely. Thomas Hartwell paid Annie for her services with an extra blanket and permission to keep a small garden plot near her cabin. But more significantly, he began to see her differently, not as a field hand, not as property, but as something else entirely, a resource valuable and strange. He began calling on her for other ailments. When his wife Constance suffered from migraines, Annie provided a tea made from feverfew and skull cap that reduced the pain more effectively than any medicine Dr. Foster had prescribed. When Hartwell himself developed a painful kidney stone, Annie gave him a decoction of hydrangea root and grathel root that passed the stone within 2 days. Word spread beyond the plantation. Neighboring planters began requesting any services for their own families and their slaves. Hartwell, recognizing the financial opportunity, began hiring her out, keeping the payment for himself. Of course, Annie would be sent to other plantations for days or weeks at a time, treating everything from childbirth complications to mysterious illnesses that had baffled trained physicians. She succeeded far more often than she failed. But success in the world Annie inhabited was a dangerous thing. The first incident that sparked genuine fear occurred in the summer of 1841 at the neighboring Lawrence plantation. Annie had been hired to treat an outbreak of dysentery that was spreading through the slave quarters. She had spent 2 weeks there preparing medicines and supervising sanitation efforts. The outbreak was brought under control, and most of the sick recovered, but Richard Lawrence, the plantation's overseer, did not recover. Lawrence had been a brutal man, notorious throughout the county for his vicious treatment of slaves. He had not contracted dysentery from the outbreak. He had complained of stomach pains that began after he ate his dinner one evening. By the next morning, he was vomiting violently. By afternoon, his hands trembled and his vision blurred. Within 3 days, he was dead. Dr. Foster examined the body and declared it to be cholera. though he privately admitted to colleagues that the symptom didn't quite align with typical cholera cases. The slaves at the Lawrence plantation whispered among themselves that Lawrence had finally gotten what he deserved, that perhaps God had struck him down, but a few noticed that Annie had been seen gathering plants near the kitchen garden the day before Lawrence fell ill. No accusations were made. No investigation was opened. Lawrence was buried and Annie returned to the Hartwell plantation. But people began to wonder. The second incident happened 6 months later in the winter of 1842. Annie had been hired by a man named George Bentley to treat his elderly mother who suffered from severe arthritis. Annie prepared a liniment that brought the old woman significant relief. But Bentley, a man who fancied himself an amateur naturalist, became curious about the ingredients Annie used. He pressed her for information about the plants in her remedies. Annie, who generally kept her knowledge close, reluctantly told him about some of the more common ingredients: loelia for breathing, poke root for inflammation, bow for cleansing the blood. Bentley began experimenting on his own, trying to recreate Annie's remedies without her guidance. He harvested poke root, but he harvested the wrong part of the plant, the roots and berries instead of just the young leaves. He prepared a tea for himself as a general tonic. Within hours, he was violently ill. Within a day, he was dead. His widow found notes he had written about his experiments. She told several people that Bentley had been trying to replicate that slave girl's medicines. The implication, though never stated directly, was clear. If Bentley had killed himself trying to make Annie's remedies, then perhaps Annie's remedies were more dangerous than anyone had realized. Perhaps she was not just a healer. Perhaps she was something else. The whispers grew louder. Slaves who had witnessed Annie's knowledge spoke of her with a mixture of reverence and unease. They told stories about how she could look at a person and know their illness without asking questions, how she spoke to plants before harvesting them, how she sometimes went into the deep woods alone and returned with ingredients no one else could identify. White planters and their families, who had once sought Annie's services eagerly, began to reconsider. They still called on her when desperation demanded it, but they treated her with a new wariness. They watched what she prepared with suspicious eyes. Some insist that their house slaves or family members observe Annie's entire process, refusing to consume anything she made unless they had seen every ingredient added. Thomas Hartwell noticed the change in attitude. He also noticed that requests for Annie's services had decreased significantly. More concerning, he began hearing rumors from other players, quiet suggestions that perhaps Annie knew too much, that perhaps it was dangerous to let a slave possess such knowledge, that perhaps something should be done about her. Hartwell found himself in an unusual position. Annie was his property, and a valuable one. Her skills had earned him considerable money, but he was also a man who understood the social currents of his world, and he could sense the growing discomfort among his peers. He called Annie to the main house one evening in the spring of 1843. "You've made some of my neighbors nervous," he told her, watching her face carefully for a reaction. Annie stood with her hands clasped in front of her, her expression neutral. "I only do what they ask me to do, Master Hartwell. I treat sick people. I don't cause harm. That overseer at the Lawrence place, the one who died, I didn't treat him," Annie replied immediately. "He was already ill when anyone told me about him, and by then it was too late. And George Bentley, Mr. Bentley tried to make medicines without proper knowledge. I warned him that plants need to be harvested correctly. He didn't listen." Hartwell nodded slowly. He believed H.R. At least he believed that she hadn't directly killed either man. But belief and reputation were different things, and reputation was what mattered in their world. "I need you to be more careful," he finally said. "Show people exactly what you're doing. Explain your methods. Make them understand that what you do is just medicine, nothing more." "Yes, Master Hartwell," Annie said quietly, but both of them knew the truth. No amount of explanation would ease the fears of people who were fundamentally uncomfortable with a slave possessing knowledge they didn't understand. Over the following year, Annie tried to follow Hartwell's instructions. When she prepared medicines for white families, she explained each ingredient in simple terms. She emphasized the natural, ordinary aspects of her work. She was careful, methodical, and transparent. It didn't matter. The fear continued to grow, fed by coincidences and misunderstandings that seemed to follow Annie wherever she went. When a man who had once refused to pay Hartwell for Annie's services died suddenly of a stroke, people remembered that Annie had been at his plantation the previous month. When crops failed at a farm where Annie had been treated poorly, slaves whispered that perhaps she had done something to the soil, though no one could say what. The truth was simpler and more mundane. The man had been elderly and overweight, prone to strokes. The crops had failed because of poor soil management and a dry summer. But people saw patterns where none existed, and they attributed to Annie a power she neither possessed nor claimed to possess. By the summer of 1844, the situation had become untenable. Several prominent planters approached Hartwell with a proposal. They would pay him handsomely to sell Annie to a trader who would take her deep into the Louisiana territories far away from Mississippi. They framed it as a generous offer. He would profit from the sale, and Annie would simply be relocated, not harmed. Hartwell considered the offer seriously. Annie had become more of a liability than an asset. The money he made from hiring her out had dried up entirely, and there was another factor he couldn't ignore. His own family had become nervous around her. His wife Constance had asked him not to bring Annie into the house anymore. His daughter Caroline, whose life Annie had saved, now avoided looking at her directly. But before Hartwell could make his decision, something happened that changed everything. One evening in late August, Thomas Hartwell ate dinner with his family as usual. The meal included greens from the kitchen garden, collards, clears, throat, and mustard greens, prepared by the cook named Betty. Hartwell ate heartily, complimenting the meal. Within an hour, he was doubled over with stomach cramps. By midnight, he was vomiting violently. By morning, his hands trembled, his vision blurred, and his heart raced irregularly. Dr. Foster was summoned. He examined Hartwell, asked questions about his symptoms, and looked genuinely perplexed. "It presents like poisoning," the doctor said quietly to Constance Hartwell. "But I cannot determine the source." Was there anything unusual about his food? Constance immediately thought of Annie. Everyone thought of Annie, but Annie had not been in the main house in weeks. She had not prepared the meal. She had no contact with the food. Still, Constance sent for her. Annie arrived and examined Hartwell carefully. She asked questions about what he had eaten, when his symptoms had begun, what they felt like. Then she asked to see the kitchen garden. She walked among the rows of vegetables with Betty the cook, following nervously behind. Annie stopped at the greens, knelt down, examined them closely. Then she moved to the edge of the garden where several plants with white flowers were growing. "White snake root," Annie said, pointing to the plants. "It's been growing in the garden for weeks. Did anyone notice?" Betty shook her head. "I thought they were just weeds. They looked harmless." Annie straightened up. "The greens are growing right beside the snake root. When it rains, the poison from the snake root washes onto the vegetable leaves. It builds up over time. Master Hartwell's been eating it for days, maybe weeks. It's called milk sickness when it comes from cows that eat snake root, but people can get it directly from eating plants contaminated by it." She returned to the main house and told Dr. Foster and Constance what she had found. Then she prepared a treatment. Activated charcoal from burned willowwood, bone set tea to help his body fight the poison, and a strict diet of bland foods and clean water for at least 2 weeks. "The poison affects the heart and liver," Annie explained, her voice calm despite the terrified faces surrounding her. "If he rests completely and takes no more poison, his body can recover, but it will take time, and he will feel weak for several weeks." Thomas Hartwell recovered exactly as Annie predicted. Within 3 weeks, his symptoms had disappeared entirely. Dr. Foster, examining the white snake root himself and consulting his medical texts, confirmed that Annie's diagnosis had been correct. The incident should have vindicated Annie, should have proven her value and knowledge. Instead, it had the opposite effect, because people began to ask a different question. How did Annie know so much about poison? The autumn of 1844 marked a shift in how Annie Turner was perceived throughout Tallahatchie County. The fact that she had diagnosed and treated Hartwell's poisoning successfully should have been celebrated. Instead, it became evidence of something darker in the minds of the white plantation owners and overseers. They reasoned in their suspicious way that only someone intimately familiar with poisons could have identified white snake roots so quickly. They whispered among themselves that Annie must have studied toxic plants as carefully as healing ones. Some went further, suggesting perhaps Annie had planted the snake root in the garden herself, then discovered it to make herself appear valuable and knowledgeable. The logic was circular and paranoid, but it spread like disease. Thomas Hartwell found himself in an impossible position. He owed Annie his life, and he knew it. But he also had to live among his neighbors and maintain his standing in the community. The pressure on him to do something about Annie became intense. A delegation of planters visited Hartwell in October. They were polite but firm. They suggested that Annie represented a threat, not because she had done anything wrong that could be proven, but because of what she could potentially do. They pointed out that she knew which plants could kill, how much would be needed, how to disguise them in food or drink. They argued that such knowledge in the hands of a slave was intolerable. "It's not a matter of what she has done," one planter said. "It's a matter of what she could do. Every time I eat a meal prepared by my cook, I'll wonder if Annie has shared her knowledge. Every time one of us falls ill, we'll suspect poison. You must see that this situation cannot continue. Hartwell did see it, though it pained him to admit it. The problem wasn't Annie's actions. It was her knowledge itself. Knowledge that couldn't be taken from her, couldn't be controlled, couldn't be locked away. He made his decision. Annie would be sold to a slave trader named Morris Hampton, who specialized in moving slaves to the developing territories in Arkansas and Texas. She would be taken far away where her reputation had not preceded her, where she could perhaps practice her healing arts. Without generating fear, Hartwell told himself it was a mercy. Annie learned of her impending sale in early November. She received the news with the same quiet composure she displayed when treating patients or facing suspicion. She asked only one question: when Hampton will collect you in December before the winter rains make the roads impassable, Hartwell told her. He couldn't quite meet her eyes. Annie nodded and returned to her cabin. She spent the following weeks continuing her work among the slaves, in the quarters, treating their ailments, teaching the younger women which plants could help a difficult childbirth or reduce a fever. She gathered seeds from her garden and distributed them to those she trusted. She carved final marks on her trees, adding the last observations to her hidden library of knowledge. She did not appear afraid or angry. She simply prepared. But something strange began to happen in those final weeks before Annie's departure. Several of the white men who had been most vocal about demanding her sale began to fall ill. It started with James Crawford, one of the planters who had led the delegation to Hartwell. He developed severe headaches and dizziness. Dr. Foster examined him but could find no clear cause. The symptoms persisted for days, then gradually faded. Then William Hughes, another planter who had spread rumors about Annie's dangerous knowledge, suffered a series of unexplained fainting spells. He would lose consciousness suddenly with no warning, and wake up minutes later with no memory of what had happened. Then Robert Finch, an overseer who had publicly stated that Annie should be whipped for putting on airs with her medicine knowledge, developed terrible nightmares. He told his wife that he dreamed of plants growing inside his stomach, their roots spreading through his body. He barely slept for a week, and when he did sleep, he woke up screaming. None of the illnesses were fatal. None could be traced to any specific cause. Dr. Foster examined each man and found nothing definitively wrong. No poisoning, no disease, no physical injury. The symptoms were real, but their origin remained mysterious. And yet, each man had eaten meals prepared by slaves. Each man had consumed water from wells that slaves accessed. Each man lived in a world where dozens of enslaved people moved through their homes and properties every day, handling their food, their drink, their belongings. The fear that had been directed at Annie now expanded into a more generalized terror. If Annie could poison someone, and no one could prove she had, but what if she could? Then what about all the other slaves? What knowledge might they possess? What might they be capable of? The white families of Tallahatchie County began to view every headache, every stomach pain, every moment of illness with suspicion. They looked at their slaves differently. They tasted their food with caution. They locked their doors at night. Annie said nothing about any of it. She continued her work, quiet and composed, counting down the days until Morris Hampton arrived to take her away. December arrived, cold and gray. Morris Hampton sent word that he would come for Annie on December 15th or Sunday. Hartwell informed Annie on the previous Saturday afternoon, telling her to have her meager belongings ready by morning. That Saturday night, Annie stayed in her cabin, burning a small fire despite the prohibition against slaves, keeping fires unattended. No one stopped her. The other slaves in the quarter sensed that something significant was ending, and they left her to her solitude, but Annie wasn't alone for long. Around midnight, there was a quiet knock on her cabin door. When Annie opened it, she found a young slave woman named Judith standing. In the darkness, Judith was 16, recently arrived at the Hartwell plantation, and she had watched Annie with hungry attention, asking questions about plants whenever she had the chance. "I need to learn," Judith said simply. "You're leaving tomorrow, and there's no one else who knows what you know." Annie hesitated. Teaching was dangerous for her and for the student, but she also understood that knowledge unused was knowledge lost. She opened the door wider and let Judith inside. They sat by the fire and Annie began to teach. She spoke quietly, knowing she had limited time. She taught Judith about the common healing plants: willow for fever, yarrow for bleeding, ginger for stomach ailments. She taught her about doses and preparations, about the difference between fresh and dried herbs, about seasonal variations in plant potency. But she also taught her about the other plants, the dangerous ones. Foxglove, Annie said, can steady a failing heart in tiny amounts. but a little too much, and it stops the heart entirely. Water hemlock looks like wild carrots, but eating a piece the size of your thumb will cause convulsions and death within an hour. Pokeweed berries are attractive to children, but they're poisonous, though the young leaves cooked properly are safe to eat. Why are you telling me this? Judith asked quietly. Annie looked at her across the fire. Because knowledge is the only thing they can't take from us. They can sell us, work us, beat us, but what we know stays with us. And sometimes knowing dangerous things is the same as being dangerous yourself, even if you never use what you know. The men who got sick this month, Judith said carefully, the ones who wanted you sold. Annie held her gaze. I didn't touch their food or drink. I didn't go near them. I didn't do anything that could be proven. But they got sick anyway. People get sick all the time. Annie replied evenly. Headaches, dizziness, nightmares. These are common ailments. They can come from bad food, bad water, worry, guilt, fear. They can come from many things. Judith nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken message. Annie wasn't admitting to anything, but she wasn't denying the possibility either. She was teaching a different lesson, that the fear of what she might have done was perhaps as powerful as any actual action. They talked until dawn began to lighten the sky. Annie gave Judith seeds from her garden and told her where to find the marked trees that contained her hidden notes. She explained the system she had created for recording information, teaching Judith how to read the marks and add her own observations. Will you be all right? Judith asked as morning arrived. In the new place. I've been sold before, Annie said. I survived. I'll survive again. How did you learn all this? Where did you come from before Hartwell bought you? Annie was quiet for a long moment. My mother was a healer in Virginia. She learned from her mother who learned from her mother. We came from a place across the ocean where women knew plants and medicine, where knowledge was passed from generation to generation. My mother taught me everything before she died. I was 13 when Hartwell bought me at auction. I told no one I knew until I saw that boy coughing and knew I could help him. And now you'll start again somewhere else? Yes, Annie said. And wherever I go, I'll watch and learn and remember, because that's what we do. We survive by knowing what others don't know. We survive by keeping our knowledge close and using it carefully. As the sun rose, Judith slipped out of the cabin and returned to the quarters. Annie gathered her few possessions, a blanket, a spare dress, a small cloth bed of seeds, and waited for Morris Hampton to arrive. Morris Hampton came at mid-morning driving a wagon with 2 other slaves already chained in the back. He was a lean man with hard eyes, professional and efficient in his business. He checked Annie's teeth and hands, verified her identity with Hartwell, and counted out the payment in cash. Hartwell took the money, but looked uncomfortable. She's a skilled healer, he told Hampton, worth more than what I'm selling her for. Whoever buys her should know that. Hampton nodded, but said nothing. He had learned not to ask too many questions about slaves being sold at prices below their apparent value. There was always a reason, and the reason was rarely good. Annie was loaded into the wagon. Her wrists were chained, though not tightly. Hampton wasn't cruel, just cautious. As the wagon began to move, Annie turned back for one last look at the Hartwell plantation. A small group of slaves had gathered near the quarters to watch her leave. Judith stood among them, her face carefully neutral. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Annie gave the slightest nod. The knowledge had been passed on. The chain remained unbroken. The White family, Hartwell, his wife Constance, and their children watched. From the porch of the main house, Caroline, the daughter Annie had saved from scarlet fever 5 years earlier, raised her hand in a small, uncertain wave. Annie didn't wave back. As the wagon rolled down the long drive away from the plantation, Annie noticed something interesting. Several of the white men who had been most vocal about demanding her sale stood near the road watching her depart. James Crawford was there, looking pale and drawn, despite his headaches having subsided. William Hughes stood beside him, and Robert Finch watched from a distance. They wanted to see her leave. They needed to see her leave. They needed the physical confirmation that the source of their fear was being removed. Annie looked at each of them as the wagon passed. She didn't smile or show any emotion. She simply looked, letting them see her face one last time, letting them wonder what she was thinking, what she knew, what she might have done or could have done. The psychological weight of that look, of that uncertainty, would stay with those men for the rest of their lives. The journey to Arkansas took 3 weeks. Morris Hampton proved to be a practical man who understood that healthy slaves sold for better prices than sick ones, so he allowed rest stops and provided adequate food. Annie used the time to observe the landscape they traveled through, noting which plants grew in different regions, how the vegetation changed as they moved west. She was sold at an auction in Little Rock in early January 1845, The buyer was a farmer named Daniel Pierce, who needed someone to help with his wife's difficult pregnancy. He had been told by a friend who knew Hampton that this particular slave had medical knowledge. Annie delivered Pierce's wife of a healthy baby boy. She stayed on Pierce's small farm, treating ailments for his family and the handful of slaves he owned. Her reputation as a healer began to grow again in this new place, though more slowly and more cautiously than before. She never returned to Mississippi, but the story of Annie Turner didn't end with her departure. If anything, it grew stronger in her absence. Back at the Hartwell plantation and throughout Tallahatchie County, the tale of the slave woman who knew too much became the subject of endless speculation and embellishment. People debated whether she had actually poisoned anyone or simply been a skilled healer who had been unjustly feared. They discussed the mysterious illnesses that had afflicted the men who demanded her sale, never reaching a consensus about whether those illnesses had been natural coincidence or deliberate retribution. The fear Annie had inspired didn't disappear with her. Instead, it transformed into something more insidious. A generalized anxiety among slave owners about what their enslaved people might know and might be capable of. Plantation owners throughout the county became more paranoid about their food, their drink, their health. They watched their slaves with new suspicion, seeing potential knowledge and potential danger, where before they had seen only property and lab. Or, some historians who study this period note that incidents of suspected poisoning, whether real or imagined, increased significantly in Mississippi during the late 1840s and early 1850s. Medical records from the time show an uptick in white patients presenting to doctors with vague symptoms and insistent claims that they had been poisoned. Though most investigations found no evidence of actual poisoning, it's possible that Annie Turner's legacy was not any specific action she took, but the fear she inspired. A fear that made powerful people suddenly aware of their own vulnerability. The story of Annie Turner might have been completely forgotten, lost among the countless undocumented lives of enslaved people, except for a discovery made in 1932. A historian named Catherine Wright was researching slavery in Tallahatchie County for her doctoral dissertation. She was examining property records and slave manifests in the county archives when she came across references to Annie Turner. Multiple documents from different plantation owners mentioning payments to Thomas Hartwell for medical services rendered by slave Annie. Intrigued, Wright began investigating further. She found Dr. Edmund Foster's personal journals, which had been donated to the archive by his descendants. In those journals, Foster wrote extensively about Annie, expressing both admiration and unease about her abilities. The Negro girl Annie possesses a knowledge of medicinal plants that exceeds my own formal education. In several respects, she diagnosed the Hartwell poisoning with a swiftness and certainty that shames me. Yet, I confess I am disturbed by the extent of her knowledge regarding toxic substances. What else might she know? What other capabilities might she possess? The planters' fear, while perhaps excessive, is not entirely without foundation. Wright also found records of the mysterious illnesses that had afflicted Crawford, Hughes, and Finch, newspaper mentions of their ailments, personal correspondence in which they discussed their symptoms and their fears. In one particularly revealing letter, Crawford wrote to a friend, "I cannot prove that the Negro woman, Annie, has done anything to me. Yet I cannot shake the conviction that my suffering is somehow connected to her. Perhaps it is guilt that afflicts me, or perhaps it is something more deliberate I will never know. And that uncertainty is its own torture." Most intriguingly, Wright's research led her to the old Hartwell plantation property, which had changed hands several times over the decades and now stood abandoned. While exploring the overgrown grounds, Wright discovered several old trees near what had once been the slave quarters. On these trees, she found strange markings, notches, and carvings that formed patterns. Wright photographed the markings and showed them to a botanist colleague who studied them carefully. The colleague's analysis suggested that the marks might represent a systematic notation system for recording information about plants, where they grew, when they flowered, possibly even their medicinal or toxic properties. If these marks were indeed made by an enslaved person recording botanical knowledge, Wright wrote in her dissertation, they represent an extraordinary act of intellectual resistance. Unable to read or write in the conventional sense, this person created an entirely new system of notation to preserve and organized scientific observation. Wright's dissertation, The Hidden Knowledge, Medical Practices Among Enslaved People in Antebellum, Mississippi, brought Annie Turner's story to light for the first time in academic literature. But the story remained obscure, known only to specialists in the field, until recently. In 2019, A team of archaeologists and historians returned to the old Hartwell plantation site as part of a larger project documenting slavery in Mississippi. They found more marked trees, some of which had survived nearly 175 years. Using modern analysis techniques, they determined that the marks had definitely been carved between 1838 and 1844, exactly the period when Annie Turner lived on the plantation. More significantly, they found something else. Buried in a hollow log near the slave quarters, they discovered a small cloth bundle containing seeds. Analysis showed that the bundle contained seeds from several medicinal plants, some common, others rare, but it also contained seeds from 3 highly toxic plants: white snake root, water hemlock, and a foxglove. The archaeologists couldn't determine when the bundle had been buried or who had buried it, but the careful way the seeds were separated and wrapped suggested deliberate preservation, someone maintaining a collection of both healing and harmful plants for reasons unknown. Dr. Marcus Hamilton, the lead archaeologist on the project, presented the findings at a conference on slavery and resistance. In his presentation, he posed a question that remains unanswered. Annie Turner had the knowledge to kill any number of people on the Hartwell plantation or any plantation she visited. She knew which plants were deadly, how to disguise them, how much would be needed. She had access to kitchens, gardens, and water supplies. Yet there is no documented case of anyone definitively dying from poisoning that could be attributed to her. So we must ask, was Annie Turner simply a healer who was unjustly feared because enslaved people with knowledge threatened the social order? Or was she something more calculated, someone who understood that the power to harm, even if never exercised, is a form of power nonetheless? Did she deliberately cultivate fear as a tool of psychological warfare, making her oppressors live in constant anxiety about what she might do? Dr. Hamilton continued, the men who got sick in late 1844, Crawford, Hughes, Finch, all recovered. Their symptoms, while real, could have been caused by many things: stress, poor diet, contaminated water, natural illness. They could have been caused by very small doses of certain substances, amounts too small to kill, but large enough to terrify. We'll never know for certain. And perhaps that uncertainty was precisely the point. The archaeological findings and Dr. Hamilton's presentation generated renewed interest in Annie Turner's story. Documentaries were proposed, articles were written. The story spread through academic circles and beyond, but the central question remained unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. What exactly did Annie Turner do? And what did she merely allow people to fear she might do? The documented facts about Annie Turner end with her sale in January 1845. Records show that a slave named Annie was purchased by Daniel Pierce in Little Rock, Arkansas. After that, the trail goes cold. She appears in the 1850 census as one of Pierce's slaves, listed simply as Annie, female, Negro, 28 years. She does not appear in the 1860 census, which could mean many things: death, sale to someone else, or escape. There are unverified reports from Arkansas in the 1850s about a skilled Negro healer who treated both white and black families in the Little Rock area, someone who was both valued and feared, but the name attached to these reports is Ann, not Annie, and the identity cannot be confirmed. What can be confirmed is the impact Annie Turner had during her 6 years on the Hartwell plantation. She created a ripple effect of fear and uncertainty that lasted far beyond her physical presence. The planters of Tallahatchie County never forgot her, and their paranoia about enslaved people possessing dangerous knowledge only intensified as the years passed and tensions over slavery grew. Thomas Hartwell's descendants preserved family papers that included letters in which he mentioned Annie several times over the years. In an 1852 letter to his brother, Hartwell wrote, "I still think about that girl sometimes, the one who knew the plants. I wonder if I did right by selling her, or if I should have kept her despite the neighbors' fears. She saved my Caroline's life, and then she saved mine. Yet, I let fear dictate my actions. I suppose we all did." The real legacy of Annie Turner isn't about whether she actually poisoned anyone. It's about the power of knowledge in a system built on enforced ignorance. The plantation system depended on keeping enslaved people powerless, and knowledge was power. When Annie demonstrated knowledge that exceeded even trained white physicians, she disrupted the fundamental assumption that enslaved people were inferior, ignorant, and controllable. The fact that this knowledge included both healing and harming made it especially threatening. The slave owners who depended on enslaved people to cook their food, tend their gardens, and prepare their medicines had to confront an uncomfortable truth. Those same people might possess the ability to harm them, the trust they had taken for granted. Or rather, the trust they had never even thought to question. on suddenly seemed dangerously naive. Annie Turner made them afraid, and that fear was perhaps her greatest act of resistance. Whether she ever actually used her knowledge to harm anyone remains a mystery. The evidence is circumstantial at best. The illnesses that afflicted her enemies could have been coincidental. The seeds of toxic plants found at the plantation site could have been preserved for many reasons: scientific curiosity, medical knowledge, or yes, potential weapons. We will never know for certain, and perhaps that's exactly how Annie wanted it. In the end, the question isn't what Annie Turner did. The question is what she made people believe she might be capable of doing. And in a world where enslaved people had so few tools of resistance available to them, the ability to make their oppressors afraid, to make them question their own safety, to make them taste their food with trembling hands, to make them wonder what knowledge might be held by the people they claimed to own, was a kind of power. A quiet, subtle, undeniable power. The power of knowledge that could heal or harm, wielded by someone who understood that sometimes the most effective weapon is the one you never have to use. The story of Annie Turner is based on fragmentary historical records and archaeological evidence. While the basic facts of her existence and her work as a healer can be documented, much of her story remains shrouded in uncertainty. This account presents one possible interpretation of those facts, but the truth, as is so often the case with the lives of enslaved people, may never be fully known. What is certain is that people like Annie Turner existed throughout the Antebellum South, enslaved people who possessed knowledge of medicine and healing, who understood the properties of plants, both beneficial and harmful, and whose very existence challenged the assumption of the system that enslaved them. Their names have been largely lost to history. Their wisdom was seldom recorded in ink or preserved in official accounts. Yet the consequences of what they knew, the fear it sparked, the lives it protected, the quiet defiance it embodied, still ripple through history for those who know how to read the silences. Annie Turner was not alone. She was simply one of the few whose story can be pieced together from the fragments that survive. How many others like her lived in silence, their lives ending without a trace? How much wisdom was lost when their voices were silenced forever? These are questions history cannot fully answer, yet traces endure. In trees marked with secret signs, in seeds hidden and carried from hand to hand, and in the anxious words recorded in letters and journals of slaveholders, a quiet truth emerges. Those who were dismissed as ignorant or powerless often held knowledge far deeper than their oppressors could imagine, passed carefully from one generation to the next, protected and wielded with discretion. This wisdom became a form of resistance that no chain or whip could ever truly extinguish. Annie Turner's story reminds us that power does not always announce itself with noise or force. Sometimes it lives in memory and skill, in understanding and knowledge, especially the knowledge of what heals and what harms, has always been one of the most formidable forms of power.